Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. And I got to say, it's a lot of fun to watch a Nebraskan award ceremony where everyone just says, "Oh, you shouldn't have given this to me," you know. Sorry about that. I apologize for taking this. So it's great, good fun to be here. Great, good fun in part to see old friends like Marion Leary and Sean Leary, Omahans, and meet lots of new friends. And the reason I really wanted to be here was because Nebraska played such an outsized role, is playing such an outsized role in this really powerful fight against the Keystone Pipeline, which has become, by proxy, the kind of great climate fight of the moment. So I'll talk about that in a second. But first, let me just say that it's always great fun for me to get to do anything with any part of the Sierra Club. My father was a Sierra Club member when he was a young man who lived in California. And of course, in those days, for him it was mostly a hiking club. Every weekend they'd disappear up into the Sierras and go for long hikes, and it was incredibly important to him. And as the Sierra Club began to transform, he kind of followed right along. When David Brower started putting out those magnificent coffee table books in the early 1960s with Elliot Porter and Ansel Adams and things, the books that sort of started rewriting our sense of the environment, they were all over our coffee table always. And as the Sierra Club recovered the legacy that John Muir had left it as the first almost the first NGO of any kind in the world, the first real crusading nonprofit organization. It was my great privilege late in his life to get to know David Brower fairly well. In fact, we once spent a memorable week in Yosemite Valley. I was doing a long interview for Rolling Stone of David Brower, and those of you who, I'm sure there's people in here who knew him, our greatest environmentalist of the late 20th century, but he was also the greatest alpinist of the early, or sort of mid 20th century. So we would sit down there in the base of the valley drinking his drink Tanqueray martinis and looking up, and he would just point out all the first ascents he'd made up out of those great mountains, and a wonderful, wonderful man. And my sense is, because we get to work together pretty closely now, that the club is back in the best of possible hands. It was one of the great things that happened in the environmental movement in this country a couple of years ago when Mike Brune took over the Sierra Club. He is a magnificent leader, very principled and very courageous and very funny and very easy to work with. Understands the thing that we've sort of stressed at 350.org since we started about 5 years ago, which is that it's important to have organizations, but it's much more important to have campaigns that we can work on across organizations. That the world in which we live, especially for younger people, is not likely to be a world in which you can persuade people to come to a chapter meeting every Wednesday for the rest of their lives, but it is a world in which you can persuade people to get deeply immersed in particular fights and campaigns for a little while and really give their all, And as I talk about that kind of generational shift, let me talk for a little bit about just watching from a distance some of the great work going on here in Nebraska as we took on this Keystone Pipeline thing. Now, the person that I got to work with the most was Jane Klebb, who I'll get to see tonight, who was a magnificent organizer, and to watch her understand sort of where Nebraska was environmentally was really interesting. Because the truth is that it's a lot farther along than people might have maybe expected from a distance. And it's testament to the good work that you all have done over the years that people's very strong environmental sense came into play. That people understood that the Sand Hills were not a treasure to be taken lightly. People understood that the aquifer was a great resource not to be polluted. This is not something that 20 or 25 years ago I think people would have understood as easily as they do. And it probably indicates that you guys have had a more successful impact on people's environmental sense than sometimes you think in this state. And that was very, very good to watch that happen. I remember getting a call from Jane one day last fall, just saying, "You won't believe what just happened. We were at the football stadium, and they put an ad on the Jumbotron in the middle at halftime for the Trans-Canada Pipeline, and everybody stood up and booed, you know." And she said, "That's remarkable," and it was remarkable and powerful and testament to your work. So, now the question is, how do we move that environmental sense into the next place we need to go? We've done a pretty good job of teaching each other around this country that we need to protect our local places and the things that we get to love and see every day. The trouble is that protecting them from particular threats, pipelines, spills, things like that, is no longer enough. By far the most insidious and dangerous threats are now coming on a global scale, and they can't be fought locally. And the pipeline is probably the perfect example. That is to say, yes, it would be very bad if there was a spill in the sandhills or it got into the aquifer, okay? But it's just as bad if it doesn't spill. If all that oil gets down to Texas and refined into gasoline and put in people's cars and then spilled into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. It's just as bad for the planet, and it's just as bad for Nebraska. You all may have noticed that you've been a little short of rainfall in the course of the last year. In fact, last week, Nebraska went from being, a week ago, 99.69% of Nebraska was in severe drought. Apparently there was one small corner of Richardson County that was only in moderate drought. But no more. As of Wednesday, the entire state is 100%, the hardest hit by drought of any state in the Union. Okay, we're coming through what will be the warmest year in American history when it's tallied up at the end of December. July was the warmest month we've ever seen. We made it too hot and dry this summer to grow much food across the most fertile farmland on the face of this planet. Okay, and that's precisely what all the climate scientists have been telling us is going to happen more and more and more frequently. There's no way it can't happen. And the response to it so far has been, as you know, completely insufficient. Here and around the country and around the world, we've accomplished very little. And so we need to somehow move people as quickly as we can into that understanding of what it's going to take to ward off, well, by far the biggest thing that ever happened. Think about this past year. We've had this record heat. I don't know about, I assume here, as where I live, it began as early as March, when we had a kind of summer in March and temperatures just off the charts. And then, you know, record wildfires across Colorado and New Mexico, fires that are still burning. The eastern entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park was closed down this morning because there's still, in December, a major wildfire raging up there in the mountains. You know, the heat that blanketed the country wasn't confined just to the continental U.S. The Arctic melted this summer in ways that we had never seen before. I was with our greatest climatologist, Jim Hansen, from NASA in New York at summer's end, and we were looking at the data, and he gave a press conference at the end of it and said, look, this isn't just off the charts, this is off the wall, the charts are tacked to, you know. This is, the only way to describe it is as a planetary emergency, he said, and so it is. And, you know, follow that, for those of us on the East Coast, with the greatest storm we've ever seen roaring up the Atlantic seaboard, the lowest barometric pressures ever recorded north of Cape Hatteras, the largest wind field we've ever seen. At the height, Sandy had tropical storm force winds 1,040 miles across. Okay, that's the kind of world we're quickly going into. That's what happens when you raise the temperature 1 degree, which is how much we've raised it so far. But the same scientists who told us that would happen are unanimous in their conclusion that unless we get off coal and gas and oil right away, way faster than any government's planning, that 1 degree will be 4 or 5 degrees before the century is out, and much of that locked in the next few years. And we cannot have a civilization if we raise temperature like that. The agronomists at Stanford and the University of Washington put out a study last year saying from this point on, every degree increase in global average temperature should cut global grain yields about 10%. Watching what happened across the Midwest this summer, you get the sense of just how possible that is. Okay? Try to imagine this planet with 20 or 30 or 40% fewer calories on it. It's just not possible. But we'll show a little tonight in part of the, we've been doing this big road show across America the last 3 weeks at 350.org, playing to big sold-out houses in 2,000 and 3,000 seat theaters all across cities in the U.S., organizing. One of the things that we show in the course of it is a speech that the president of Exxon gave last summer, in which he finally said what all, since there's really no way to deny it anymore, finally said what all his predecessors had refused to say. Oh, it's true, global warming is real, he said, but it's an engineering problem, it has engineering solutions. And someone says, well, what do you mean engineering solutions? Well, if we need to move our crop production areas around to adapt, then we will. Okay? That's what people in Nebraska need to understand. That's the plan of the oil industry somehow, is that we're going to move our farming industry to Siberia. It's a fantasy, of course, because there's no soil up there. I mean, it's warm enough, or it's increasingly getting warm enough. Exxon has melted the tundra on our behalf, but you still can't grow anything up there because there's nothing. I mean, you put the corn plant in, it's going to fall right over. You know, there's nothing to hold it up. That's one future. The other future, but we have to get to it really fast for it to matter. The other future is this future where we stop powering ourselves with hydrocarbons and figure out that the time's come to do it with sun and with wind, and to get there really fast. Now, we used to sort of say that without really knowing if it was completely possible to do it with the speed which we need. But increasingly, we see signs that it is possible. Not here, where we're still just, making small incremental progress, but in a few countries that have actually done their best. There's really one big country on earth, one non-Scandinavian country that's done its best to get us there, and that's Germany. The country that caused the most problems in the 20th century is actually showing the way, in a sense, in the 21st. The German energy minister in the very conservative government of Angela Merkel said 2 weeks ago, our plan was that we would have a third of our energy coming from renewable power by 2020, but we are going to blow past that. It's certain that we'll be at 50%, and it seems likely we'll be closer to 2/3, okay? There were days this summer when Germany generated more than half the power it used from solar panels within its borders. Okay, and this is Germany. Munich is north of Montreal. It's not Texas, California, Nevada, Arizona, all the places we have in this country to kind of pad out our statistics. They generate, last week, they were generating a third of their electricity from wind turbines within their borders. They're quickly building big offshore wind turbines to complement the ones they have onshore. They're figuring it out. It's not easy, it's not cheap, but it is incredibly cheap compared with not doing it. The first estimate of the price of this summer's drought in this country is on the order of $150 billion. It looks like Hurricane Sandy probably cost upwards of $100 billion. This stuff begins to add up into real money at a certain point, and the thought of doing it year after year after year, and the thought of the human toll, and the thought of the human toll every place else around the world where people have done nothing to cause this problem, and yet they are suffering grievously from it, should get us quickly to work. The point that we're trying to make as we travel around the country is that this has to be both a practical and a moral battle that we are fighting, that we have to understand that it's really the great moral battle of our time, and that it should cause us to use the kind of tools we've used in the past. One thing that we've been talking about is the need for our institutions, churches and colleges, to sell their stock in the fossil fuel industry that's forever lobbying and preventing us from getting anywhere on this issue. And one of the people that'll be up on the screen tonight is our great friend from South Africa, Desmond Tutu, the Anglican Archbishop, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in liberating that country. And he reminds us that that divestment movement then, a quarter century ago in this country, was a great help in that work, and asks us to do it again. So the good news, and it really is good news, is that people all over the place are stepping up. We've been playing this, doing this roadshow to sold-out audiences night after night after night, people stepping up to buy tickets in large numbers in order to come and get their marching orders, get organized. And in the course of those 2 weeks, we have, as of yesterday, over 100 campuses that have now very active divestment movements underway. The mayor of Seattle stood up and said, we're figuring out how to take our public money out of the fossil fuel industry. We've got to take that industry in short order and make them the new tobacco industry, okay? Remove their veneer of social respectability, take away their social license until such time as they're willing to become an energy companies, not fossil fuel companies. That clearly, with their expertise and their capital flow, could play a large role in helping us make the transition we need to make. But they're not playing that role now, just the opposite. They're spending millions upon millions of dollars every month making sure with their lobbyists and their campaign donations that we never make the transition away from fossil fuel, which is the great task of human beings in our time. There is no greater task than probably that we've ever had, and we're going to need every bit of ingenuity, and we're going to need those sort of obstacles out of the way if we're to even begin to replicate what the Germans are demonstrating is entirely possible to do. The final thing I'll just say is, one of the things that's been happiest for me about this work over the last couple of years is to watch how diverse the environmental movement is suddenly becoming. There was a period of time when people were very worried about the kind of graying of the environmental movement, that it was a generation of people who'd sort of come in the 1970s with the first Earth Day and things, and that they weren't being replaced in a sense. And I can tell you for sure that that's no longer true. The climate movement's being led by young people in this country and all over the world, and in huge numbers. But it's also true that their elders are doing a great job of stepping up and helping. I've already met here today at least 2 or 3 people who came to Washington and got arrested who stand up if you're here, who came to get arrested in that fight. We're very, very grateful. So, one of the things we said when I wrote the letter asking people to come was, we do not think that young people should have to be the only cannon fodder in this fight. Because if you're 22 in our economy, okay, maybe an arrest record is not the best thing on your resume right now, okay? One of the few blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, and so it was very good to see a lot of people with, hairlines like mine arriving in Washington. This was the largest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country. Had people from every state in the union. We didn't ask people, how old are you, when they were getting arrested, but we did say, who was president when you were born, okay? And the 2 biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations. And the last day there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He'd been born in the Warren Harding administration. which frankly, I'd almost forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was a really good sign to see people stepping up. The final thing I'll say, and I'll say it again tonight when we're talking at the a big show tonight, is just to keep reminding everyone around you that there is nothing at all radical in what we are talking about as we talk about these things. Just the opposite. All we're asking for is a world that works the way the one we were born into worked, a world that works the way everything's worked for the last 10,000 years of the Holocene. There's nothing radical about that. That's a conservative demand, okay? Radicals at this point work in the fossil fuel industry. If you're willing to make your fortune altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, pouring carbon into the atmosphere, even though we now know it is the most dangerous thing that human beings have ever done, then you're more radical than anyone who ever came before you. You're changing the world in ways that no one else has ever changed it before. And it's our job to figure out how to check that radicalism before it overwhelms everything, before it changes the climate, before it changes the lives of countless people and species, before it changes the very beautiful places that we love and that we have worked really, really hard to protect. The 20th century and its environmentalism was a kind of warm-up act for the 21st century. We learned in the course of the last century, with the Sierra Club in the lead, with John Muir's kind of new grammar and rhetoric of wildness, as our guide. We learned how to love things that we'd taken for granted before, places and landscapes and images. The job of the 21st century is to learn how to love it at an even larger scale, to understand that really the world is connected in ways that we didn't understand even a few years ago, and that we have to work on that scale if we're to protect both the world itself and the particular places we love. No place exists in isolation any longer, not even, far-flung and remote parts of a place like Nebraska. It's all tied together in all kinds of ways. That's both the great trouble we face and the great blessing, because it means that everybody, every place, is going to be part of the solution if there is going to be a solution. So it's just, for me, a great honor to get to be among you. We'll keep fighting this Keystone Pipeline just as hard as we possibly can. We're going back to Washington on President's Day weekend for a big demonstration, and I hope you all are there. But we're also going to do more than play defense, do more than try to fight it one pipeline and one coal mine and one oil well at a time. If we're going to win, we're going to have to play some offense too, and that means taking on the fossil fuel industry and explaining that they've become a problem, that they've become a kind of rogue force, and that they need to be reined in before they overwhelm everything around us that's worth having. So I will stop there and just say thank you all for your work so much, and what a pleasure to get to be with you for a few minutes.